Hey everyone. So we're here in Crime and Ornament at Silverlens, and we have Theo Abad and Seth Syjuco to join us. We'll be doing a short walkthrough and then a conversation with the artist, and there's a Q&A afterwards. So Steph, if you could take us through the space.
Oh, great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. And so I'm going to just introduce, I think, my portion of the exhibition as we wait for Pio. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much to Silverlens for hosting this. And also, thank you, everyone, for coming, because I know we're spanning multiple time zones right now. I'm beaming in from Oakland, California, and it's Monday night, and I know folks are a little earlier in the Philippines, so thanks for making it over here. So if you look at the Silverlens window that shows the green gallery space that's painted along with the what look like banner objects in them, that is sort of, I guess, what I would consider the centerpiece of my contribution. And just as a reminder, this is a two-person exhibition, so I was very lucky to be invited by Silverlens Gallery to show with Pio Abad. And in my conversations with Pio, because we'd actually met a number of years ago when Pio was in the Bay Area in California to do research, actually, for an earlier show. And so from there, we sort of realized that we had a lot of intersections. And so this two-person exhibition, I think, is a really wonderful way to both introduce my work, but also to have a kind of visual conversation, because as you might notice from, if you visited the exhibition or if you have just seen the images that we're showing you right now, we are working with the contemporary visuals of protest. And that's quite apparent from everything from Pio's, the dress form that Pio has kind of in the center of the space, along with printed silk scarves. And then in my area, so we've sort of split the gallery almost in half, really. My area is the part with the green painted walls, the green photographs, and then the white and black banners. And so just to go into my work in particular, the project is dates from 2017, and it's a project called Citizens. And I produced it actually right after the 2016 United States presidential election. And it was in direct response to the election of Donald Trump at the time, and also the kind of the aftermath, which really showed a kind of political battle that played out even after the election. So a number of white supremacist organizations and white nationalist groups were starting to become emboldened, and I was witnessing these protests happening at UC Berkeley campus, where I'm currently a professor. And so the work that you're seeing uses this green, very vibrant chroma key green. And so for those of you that are familiar with digital imaging technologies, that bright green is kind of what they use in the background. So when you photograph or video somebody, you can actually substitute that green color in the background for any type of backdrop. And so I use that as a kind of visual marker, both as a kind of I guess an alarming color, because not many things in the world are that color. It really is about a digital post-production technique. And the images that I photographed, or the objects that I photographed, I constructed using all chroma key green backdrop fabric and painted objects in that color. And so these aren't photoshopped in the sense that, I didn't turn the color of the objects into that green. I actually made them that color and then photographed them. And so what you're looking at here are images that represent reconstructions of the aftermath of street protests that I attended. And so after a protest would happen, there would be littered on the ground everything from broken barriers to bricks to flags and sticks and kind of ad hoc weapons, because a lot of these protests that were happening at the time were very heated. So from there, we kind of move on to what appear to be these black and white banners that are standing on metal sort of structures. And these are they're hand-sewn banners that I produced using digital images as source material. So they're actually almost impossible to read. I had downloaded images of a protest banner that had been coming up at lots of the different anti-fascist rallies that were happening at UC Berkeley. And the original text on it said, "Become ungovernable." And it was basically folks that were arguing that if the government itself becomes oppressive and actually, stops becoming a kind of democratic institution, that perhaps it's up to the citizens to become ungovernable and resist. And so unfortunately, the text, though, is illegible, and that's because when the banners were photographed, they were usually photographed being held up and sort of drooping or with people in the way. And so what we're looking at here are actually, the kind of the image of the banner, but turned back into an object. It's a very layered process. Oh, look, and there's Pio. Hi, Pio. Nice to see you. Wonderful.
In typical Manila fashion, the person from Manila is later than the person from Oakland. I got caught in traffic. These things happen, but it's so nice to see you, and I'm so happy we've been able to do this together at such an incredible time, in this country, and it's really captured a moment. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. I just thought I'd...
No, absolutely. I mean, I think this is perfect because, so I gave my introduction, but the work that I'm showing is actually a number of years older. I produced this work back in 2017. And so to resuscitate it and bring it in with your work in a very contemporary moment, let's pass it on to you and then, talk about that intersection as well as, what this moment means.
I think in the same way that I'm not really showing new work. The work that I'm showing here is stuff I produced from 2012 and 2017. So there is this, apart from the shirt, which I'll talk about later. And it's really, like you said, you made the photographs in the aftermath of presidential elections in 2016 and the protests that emerged after it. And I guess in a very similar way, maybe we can navigate the show, I don't know. The scarves, which, form a significant part of my contribution to the show, were made in the aftermath of another dark chapter, which is the Supreme Court's decision to basically reinter the corpse of Ferdinand Marcos, the thieving dictator, into the National Heroes Cemetery, effectively distorting history as we've come to witness it. And so these scarves are, the signs that are emblazoned in each scarf are actually appropriated from those protest signs at the time. And the backdrop, you can see there's the profile of Ferdinand Marcos and these various accoutrements around her is actually from a much earlier work I made in 2012 when I began to work with silk as a pattern. And it depicts this, Imelda's kind of re-envisioning of herself as the Assyrian queen Semiramis. Just after an assassination attempt sometime in the 70s, she was convinced that she lived and became reincarnated as Semiramis. But then as this fantasy was being constructed, they realized that no one really knew what Semiramis looked like. So they just replaced her imagery with Nefertiti, so these kind of inappropriate appropriations carry on. And alongside that, I'm showing a work from 2012, which is this, traditional Filipino terno, but it's covered in these Heinz sandwich spread patterns. And the story goes that when the people kind of streamed into the palace after the revolution, they found in a house deep into the palace compound. You know, there was a whole house filled from floor to ceiling with Heinz sandwich spread, catering-sized jars. And you know, on the one hand, it showed like the Marcus's kind of indiscriminate hoarding, but also I think for Imelda, it was this kind of strange embodiment of luxury that she wanted as a kid that she then achieved. So all of these fantasies kind of cruelly colliding with political reality, you know, it's something I think is incredibly present in both our works. But I was really thrilled when, you know, when you agreed to do this show, because apart from, you know, the political nature of our practices, there's also an engagement with surface, with a hand, with craftsmanship. And on one hand, that's actually recognizing the limits of art. You know, there's only certain things you can do as an artist, and there's a lot more you can do as a citizen. And to kind of, to understand that limit, but also to be empowered by that limit is something that, you know, I think we both try and navigate. And then I thought I'd wear this third artwork, which is a shirt. As you can probably tell, I'm deeply, you know, definitely now deeply involved in the campaign against Marcos Jr. Coming into running for presidency, and Lenny Robredo is his opponent, and it basically is the embodiment of everything that the Marxists aren't. So I thought I'd kind of wear this and offer another counter narrative amongst all these counter narratives. And I think interestingly, obviously, you know, the chroma key was something you did in 2016, 2017, and the work I did was in 2017, 2012, but this red and green color motif is actually the Marcos Duterte campaign colors. So, you know, speaking of criminality and ornament, and maybe, you know, some people misunderstood our title as a take on crime and punishment, with ornament replacing punishment, which I think is also really appropriate given the state of affairs now.
Yeah, absolutely, Pio. Well, I think then what is interesting too, right, is that maybe despite the fact that we did these works, you know, a couple years ago, I mean, it's to bring it back now, right, means obviously that these things haven't gone away. And I think that's what's so fascinating, is that no matter what the political outcomes of either, you know, say a United States election or the Philippine election, there still is the forces that put these people into positions or potential positions of power will still be there. And so it's this kind of, you know, underlying, like, you know, constant to have to sort of fight against or do battle with, or keep, you know, bringing into the spotlight, because, you know, it's, you know, even for decades, for even centuries, right? It's like, you know, the oppressive forces, they don't go away. They just find new methods of, you know, of pulling people down. So I guess, like, I'm curious about, you know, considering you did make these before, and were you at all thinking that it would ever get to this point?
That's the thing. I mean, I think concurrent to this exhibition, I have another exhibition in Manila, which is, in a way, this is very much a part of that project. And, you know, thankfully, through our conversations, I was able to find a venue for the fabric works to, you know, to be relevant, as well as all the other things I'm sharing at the moment. But I look back to when I started this project in 2012. Sorry, they're going to get me a share. You know, when I started this Marcos project in 2012, in fact, when you know, when the dress is actually a part of my degree share work at the Royal Academy. I mean, speaking about like really going full survey mode. It was, you know, 2012 was a radically different place, right? These flamboyant dictators from the Middle East have just been ousted through these series of protests, you know, called so-called Arab Spring. Obama was president, Aquino was president, and it seemed like I mean, I say this a lot, but it seemed like social media was going to be this like democratizing entity that would free us from the shackles of, singular narratives. But little did we know that multiverses would be more lethal than singular narratives. And so, I guess, you've done the same thing, that these works have become organic to the times, and that they've unfolded as history has disassembled. And it's, it's incredibly hair-raising, I think, to think about, what the times were when I started this work and where we are now. And, these works then, yes, they become documents of a particular moment, but like you said, they become these portals into these unending cycles of impunity, of white supremacy, of corruption. And as artists, what can we do? Like, we can't legislate. We can't, I don't know what, we can't change the world directly, but I think the imaginary impulse that we have is so important. And I think, having been in the Philippines now, for nearly a month after being away for 3.5 years, that you can see this. There is a really beautiful, I was rereading the text that was written for our exhibition, but there was a bit about, this kind of explosion of imagery and songs coming from people's throats. And there's an explosion of creativity in the city. And it's all coming from the realization that there is so much at stake here. Like our past is at stake as much as our future. So, it's like coming back here again after there was a Lenny Robredo rally over the weekend where 500,000 people came out in the streets wearing pink. The antithesis of Duterte and Ferdinand Marcos's toxic masculinity was really like, this is like seeing that and then seeing this show again. Just, it gives me some, it gives me goosebumps because it's present. And this show actually extends in the spirit of this show, that spirit of creativity extends out in the streets.
Yeah, I think what you said was interesting about, I'm just going to riff on here, unless someone stops me. Should we just do this?
That's what we do anyway.
Yeah, well, because you said something about like, well, what can we do, right? We're artists, we can't legislate, and yeah, I mean, there's a certain sort of like, there's certain roles, right, that we take on at different times. And the one thing though, we're both professors, we're both teachers, and so I'm going to assume that you also get asked this question a lot from students who want to work politically or address politics in their work. And one of the things I tell them actually is that the most important thing first is to be a citizen. And I mean that in a kind of, someone who's like engaged, civically and politically engaged. That's like to make artwork about something without actually participating is a kind of halfway point actually. And so, your artwork doesn't, it's best to kind of take on, that kind of activity as an actual work. And then the artwork is also something that then can be made as well, because obviously the two areas kind of, they can speak to different things. Like, in the best of sort of like an artist's career, the work that we make can live on, beyond, whatever time it's made, but hopefully also become a kind of historical marker for that moment. And, potentially even offer metaphors that weren't apparent, at the beginning of when it was made. So, I mean, one thing I know is that when I first made the work shown in 2017, it also accompanied a series of portraits, of restaged portraits of anti-fascist protesters. And a lot of people didn't know what to make of the work because it was so not like time hadn't passed yet. And if anything, people were still very fearful about what the Trump government could, kind of do or legislate in response to any kind of visual of, opposition. I mean, really, and so now, even if, now that we have a different president in the US, it feels a little more, open, whatever that means. And so now people can kind of look back on it and see this work under a slightly, I guess, historical lens of a couple years. But even at the time when I was making it, I felt I was taking oddly a risk because, things were still unfolding. It was like I was making work in real time. So I guess I'm curious about, like, are you making work currently, you think, that is sort of unfolding in real time?
Like everything is unfolding, especially like bringing the work back here. So, alongside this project, this reconstruction of Marco Salute that's taken me 10 years to produce, the idea that by even the act of bringing it together and bringing it to a specific site makes it, a new work really, because every time it's in conversation with a different public, it is activated in a different way, and even I understand it in a different way, and I guess that's the thing. As we're making these works in response to unfolding events, there's also the sense that, at least I'm sure you are as well, but I am, that there's a sense of foresight that ultimately these works become sites of remembrance. And then that changes what the work is, and that either kind of enriches what the work is, or it exposes your naivety to the history that you're responding to, which then makes you kind of revisit it. And there's a text of right behind me, and it's a protest sign that says the sequel is usually worse than the original. And it was actually intended, it was a reference to the current president rather than the dictator's spawn. The work then shifts completely as the world gets darker, but also as voices of dissent find, these moments of solidarity. I do feel like, having had these conversations with you over the past few months, that as we've been talking about events, the show has become braver in a way. And through that, it's, I find some people think that you made the dress, which I find super interesting, because for me, it was this perfect bridge to the wall. And I love that. I love the kind of fluidity that happens when you work with another artist. But in a way, we kind of not really produced a show, but some kind of like epic ruin made of very soft things, like soft ruin.
Yeah, no, and I think materially speaking too, that was what was so wonderful about this, is that, I mean, everywhere you look, you see a kind of like textile.
Yeah.
And, and that's interesting because, the textiles, they're everything from, say, the banners that you'll see out in the world to your t-shirt, the very fabric that we wear as clothes. Yeah, and and the slogans and everything from the Heinz the logo there, and then the resuscitated protest slogans. Like, I think I like to think a lot about that the word fabricate, as in like to fabricate, actually comes from the root word fabric, or fabrica, which is to to make. As well as the textiles. So there's this whether it's like making meaning, making artwork, making objects. There's a lot in there in the kind of I guess the malleability of that materials, the materials that we're working with. So it's a lovely pairing. And interestingly, so this is just a side note to those who are joining us. This was actually Plan B. Like, our first pass at a show was actually way more subtle.
Yeah.
And then we were actually told it was too subtle, which was great.
Which was a really, really good wake-up call, going, yeah, it was too subtle.
I know we were going the decorative route. There was going to be images of, say, like floral flowers and floral backgrounds and the kind of ornament, of,
I think
say,
I was gonna do like Ronald Reagan's porcelain collection.
yeah, we were gonna go very, and then I think it was almost too metaphoric maybe for what the Times called. So even though weirdly enough, some of our works right now are still pretty heavy with metaphor or are illegible in some cases, at least, they kind of push towards that, the voice,
Yeah.
like, a stronger voice coming out of it.
I think also, I think for me, the role of fabric is always really interesting because the reason people forget, the reason historical amnesia is so prevalent is because sometimes history is so epic and so overwhelming, but to kind of root it back into a dress or a banner or things that were held up as protest implements, but then like discarded, or a T-shirt, like it returns that epicness of history to the body. And I think ultimately the body as the witness is, why we're doing this and why we're experiencing these things. And I had this actually incredible moment on Saturday where I gave some of these shirts to, and that's why, to the Robredo campaign. And I managed to get to the quite front of the stage. And then her three daughters came out wearing the shirt, in front of these people. And I thought it was such like, I was thinking about this in relation to that and how they kind of, they're almost like the opposites of each other. There's something mundane about a T-shirt and the grandness of that dress, but also the obfuscated condiment versus the kind of T-shirt that's, facing 500,000 people. You can't get more kind of binary than that, I think.
That sounds like an amazing moment. I really wish I were there. I mean, it's so difficult, to watch all this from afar, and also just to see you in the space. And I really wish I could have seen your other show too in person. I'm curious, like, how are we doing on schedule for events or Silverlens Gallery folks?
Oh, yeah, we can just keep talking, and then 3 hours later, we're still talking. Do we doing questions, or how do you want to do this, Meg? Or we can just. Oh, we have 15 minutes for questions. Sorry?
Then Q&A.
Oh, we've got 15 more minutes to talk.
Oh.
Which is,
oh, and then Q&A.
Then Q&A.
Well, actually, here, a question popped in, and it could also, start triggering some discussion points, maybe.
Questions, I think. Is there suppression, censorship of art in the Philippines like there is journalism? Not at the moment, actually. I think there's been this like. What has happened though is there's been a fragmentation of information in the Philippines. So there isn't really like a main newspaper or a main TV channel, because those have been slowly dismantled. So, and I guess, in the mainstream experience of information, art is still quite rarefied, which is why, and I'm worried about saying this here because then it might pounce on it, but it's still like this space where you can, perform critique, or you can create work that, that criticizes, prevailing powers, because it's still, quite a small space that hasn't been infected by this government or this government's intentions. So in a very long-winded answer, that is, art is still very much a space here where you can, you can say things uncensored for the time being.
Well, it's uncensored, but also quite metaphoric too.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it is just sort of like slogans without, that kind of sort of conceptual twist or a vehicle behind it.
And I guess that's something that maybe, I'm interested in both our works, because we, we just about play with tropes of agitprop, right? But then as you get lost in the material, it becomes something else. And I think that transformative quality of the work just from just being slogans to something that is experiential, I think is really important.
Yeah. Well, I think what I've also noticed too, and I mean, the audience too can, chime in if they'd like on this in the chat, is that, so I feel like, at least in the US, there are these sort of waves where like, quote unquote, political work kind of, comes forward as something that people want to pay more attention to. And obviously, I think that reflects both kind of like the larger economic conditions and also the perception that people have of, contentment, honestly, right? So I've been around long enough, to kind of see that in the 1990s in the United States and much earlier, of course, there was a kind of resurgence of like politically motivated artwork, and it comes in waves, and now we're back up at another wave of it, where a lot of younger artists are now starting to kind of like really bring it to the forefront again. And honestly, even just say 10 or 20 years ago, it wasn't as I think quote unquote fashionable or cool to do so. And I don't want folks to take what I say here as a kind of far-reaching statement. It's just more of like I think that now that if we were to look kind of globally, really, and seeing this sort of resurgence of authoritarian governments and movements, and take it out of just say the Philippines and the United States, there really are like larger patterns in which I think hopefully there's going to be more of a groundswell too of a very international type of resistance to these things, because it's they're not isolated, right? And so I'm curious, like Pio, what you think sort of about the kind of label or moniker that's sort of put on political art versus like how it's been seen even recently prior.
Well, I think that's the thing. I was thinking about the ways that the government has been undermining art. It's not so much the closure of exhibitions, but speaking of like toxic throwbacks, there's been this phrase called red tagging. So artists, writers, poets, journalists, even politicians who kind of explicitly show dissent, representations of dissent in their work, are kind of tagged, with the communist moniker, which then allows the state apparatus to, to enact punitive measures against them. And I think I was going back to this question about suppression, and there have been methods of suppression that aren't out and out closure of exhibitions. I mean, there's still a space to create, but that, that kind of unimaginative and really regressive act of ascribing this to an artist or a creative is something that has happened here. But I think, in terms of political art, in the Philippines at least, it's very much rooted in social realist representations, and from my end, that's something that I've actively in a way moved away from. While the work is very much politically engaged, someone said that there was a write-up of the show in Ateneo where it looked like a showroom. There is the role of seduction, I think, is really important, right? That to be able to invite people into a polemic, they really want to. The first thing you want to make sure they do is they make sure they want to look at your work first.
Oh.
Yeah. Like drawing people in, and then later on, kind of laying out the case. Is a strategy that I think we both share.
Yeah, and I think too, there's also an interesting challenge about making work as Filipinos abroad. So, and by that I mean, in my experience of being Filipino American, I found that if making work that has a kind of content that relates to the Philippines here, unfortunately, sometimes it can be easily segmented into this kind of like specialty thematic box, as opposed to applying it to much larger issues of, say, American colonialism and empire. It sort of gets put away neatly just because of the way the United States has a tendency to kind of shift its artists of color into a kind of marginal space, really, just to say that, oh, well, that doesn't apply, to like the larger, context of United States art. So I guess I'm just curious. I see we have another question in the chat that we can get to too, but, just in terms of the being based in the UK mostly, right? I mean, you call the UK your home. And so I'm curious about what's the reception in the UK of your work, especially the work that's specifically about the history of the Philippines.
Well, it is interesting, because I guess, as the heart of empire, or the beating post, there are like narratives that people in the UK still aren't able to process, especially because the Philippines is outside, the rubric of British imperialism. So, there are, I think over time, my work has been present enough that it's been able to be read in different ways. But there is still I think, as you said, like, there is still this failure to read something geopolitical as allegorical. Because it just stays within that geographical sphere. But actually, when you look at what the Marcoses really stood for, it's impunity that exists everywhere in the world. It's, the wealth they amassed was enabled by neoliberal, the early incarnations of neoliberal structures. And so in that sense, I think slowly people have begun unpacking it according to these larger constellations, but it's been a long slog.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what I've found in the US is that most Americans are taught nothing about the history of the United States and the Philippines. And so it's like a big kind of like blank spot. So there actually is nothing to kind of, grab onto for a lot of people in terms of seeing the work. If I'm making work about, say, Philippine history.
But it's funny because actually Philippine history, at least the material remnant of Philippine history, resides in the US, right? These documents of conquest, these like, I remember when we met in 2019, I think at the time I was spending a lot of time like neck deep in Ronald Reagan's archives, and seeing how the Reagans and the Marcoses were incredibly close. I think because, both couples had this incredible penchant for, I don't know, turning, like for creating these fantasies and turning them into, self-serving narratives. You could see how through their correspondence, how the Marcoses were enabled by Americans, fearful of communism rising in the region. And that's, if you zoom out even further, it's a much larger history of enabling corruption, enabling impunity in the quote unquote only American colony ever. But that's not true.
Yeah, I hear you. So there's a question here from Julia Montesa asking, for the artists, how do the chroma elements translate to a space like the Philippines, which is still quite different culture to an Asian experience on an American space? I actually, so the chroma key green, when I chose to use it, I was using it as a kind of actually sort of generic mediated space. In other words, like, because of, Pio mentioned that with the rise of social media and, news organizations kind of creating different forms of truth or fake news, or whatever, I was sort of seeing the chroma key green as this marker that's now a kind of international method creating, manipulated narratives. So even though it originated from my experience in the United States, I actually, if we take it back to say, early days of, after the Arab Spring, and then into, all the campaigns that are happening internationally, politically, in which, there's massive manipulations of media. In a way, I think it works. And then with Pio's dress, that also just really worked really well.
And I think also, speaking of manipulated media and fake news, it's Sara Duterte's campaign colors. So, there is that, yes, it's this space you can project on, but I think the moment you bring it here, in this heightened political climate where every color is ideological, it's actually incredibly specific and appropriate. Maybe like neither of us were really aware of this when we were planning the show, but how it's kind of unfolded in real time has been really fascinating to watch.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting thing to bring up. And then there's a question from Jane asking, has Imelda Marcos seen your dress?
I don't think she has. There's also another question, which may be related to that. Like, am I finished with the Jane Ryan and William Saunders project? The short answer is I don't know, because every time I say I'm done with something, something else crops up, and it keeps on. Maybe artists are never really finished, and it's in trying to reach a conclusion that work is made, but it's in failing to reach that conclusion that a practice develops.
I'm wondering, I see people I know here in the audience, clicking through these.
Let's call them out, shall we?
Let's have a conversation. I know. Oh, okay. Issa's already provoking us with one last question.
Oh, one last question. I think I was trying to think about where our paths intersect, which is not so much the show, but the other thing I've been doing, obviously, is I've been really involved in my aunt's estate, Pasita Abad, and you will be involved. You will make a cameo in the retrospective catalog. But speaking of like reclaiming Asian American histories and how there's this kind of wave of realization that this history has been absent in the telling of a nation's narrative arc. It's been really interesting having, obviously not being Asian American, not being Filipino, but having a window in how much is happening, and also how much more work needs to be done.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And since you were spending time in American archives too, like looking for traces of the Philippines and how, the Marcos dictatorship actually was enabled by that. And then, more recently, I've been doing a lot of research in American archives also, but looking for historical documents and photographs of the Philippines, from the Spanish-American War and just afterwards. And it's so amazing how, again, thanks to all the scholars and the researchers and the artists and historians that are doing this work, but it's so out of the public imagination. And it's weird to think that it's taking like 100+ years to kind of catch up to these things. And again, maybe it's because, living in the United States, that is really the heart of that kind of form of empire. And so it doesn't have to see what it doesn't want to see.
Yeah. It's funny, like in November, I was in Pittsburgh because I was going through you do too. We love spending time in the back rooms of museums where every time like you open a book, like a bit of paper that's like 500 years old falls and you're like, wow. But I was going through Andrew Carnegie's papers, and the story goes that he was a staunch anti-imperialist because he was a staunch capitalist, and he thinks it's the role of industry and not the state to gather to extract resources from smaller countries. But you know what I found out, but he actually tried to buy Philippine independence from the US for $20 million. So you know all of these.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So all of these incredible narratives, you know, are still waiting to be discovered. And I think, you know, I'm so happy. I've been asked that we need to wrap up because we can keep talking. You know, I'm so happy that we're able to do this show because I think both of us are incredibly committed to, you know, this act of creative excavation. And I think to be able to have this conversation with your work, which I hope will be the first of many, has been a real pleasure. And to be able to show it at such a key moment when, like, you know, the past urgently needs to be made present, you know, palpable, tactile, you know, is incredible. Yeah, so yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to Isa and Rachel and all at Silverlens who actually made this possible. And to Isa for actually going, stop being so subtle, just fucking do it.
I know, get rid of the flowers. Let's put up the protest signs. It's like, oh yeah, okay, you're right.
Go with the guts. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Pio. Yeah, gallery folks, do you want to come on or is it?
Say something, I don't know. Just wrap up. Well, okay, I think that's Isa. Do you want to come in? Isa and Rach.
Yeah.
There they are. There they are.
What
Hi
up?
guys.
Folks.
Super
All right.
love the show. Yeah, it's our way of showing really love for country, and I think that's the most important message. So yes, that's it, Steph. Pia, thanks a lot. Thanks for coming home. Thanks for the Ateneo show.
Oh,
Stephanie, hoping you can come join us sometime this year.
I'd like to try.
We are ready for you.
you don't need the quarantine anymore.
Yeah.
And what I did was like a week of install, a week in the beach, and then a week of install. I really recommend it.
Oh, that sounds amazing.
I also want to give a shout out to Astria, who is here. I think she's doing an incredible job in dismantling white supremacist narratives. So, hey, Astria.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Astria. Thank you, Matt Miranda, who I see also here, who I worked with.
Hey, Matt.
My mom was here, or she's still here, Angela Silva. There's a curator from that I was recently talking to here too. So anyway, thank you for joining you all. Have a good night.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Salamat.